Most people could give you an example of what lateral violence is, but they don't show a deep understanding of the root causes, and they don't show an understanding that it's a systemic issue.
The worst lateral violence you can experience is the one that follows you home. When you're connected to a person in a community, that becomes pretty stressful. Welcome to the next episode of Impact Policy. Our fearless leader, Sammy Johnson, is taking a break. So myself, Kuyan Mitchell, Rajri Ngunnawal Bunjalung Man, and Shawnee McCarthy, my colleague here, Gumbengian Bunjalung Man, stepped in. I'd first like to start by acknowledging country. We're here in Willow on Gadigal country at our new home. We sort of jumped straight into a conversation today without a lot of build-up, so I do apologise. I'll break down the fourth wall. We've been doing a lot of work around lateral violence and also, relating that work to our own experiences, both professionally and personally. So me and Shawnee decided to jump in front of the camera today, just discuss our views on the nuances of lateral violence, and I guess advice for people navigating it in their own spaces. Thanks for tuning in. Shawnee, Brad, we've been picking up on some topics around the office related to some pieces of work we've been leading, and including some support we've been providing to Aboriginal mob across the state, working in different sectors. We thought we'd bring it to the podcast today to bring these discussions to everyone who's tuning in. What's a topic, I guess, that's jumped out at you in the last month or so?
Lateral violence keeps coming up. A fair bit in a fair bit of our work, and across different sectors as well. And I think some of the nuances around that too keep popping up, and that's been sort of pretty prevalent, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point because obviously been a few topics of conversation for us recently and how they intersect. And I think lateral violence has been really essential at the moment with mob that we've been working with. I guess, it's a really nuanced and complex area because it's mob interacting with mob. These are negative interactions. But then we also have to look at, the factors that build the environments for this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Like, lateral violence wouldn't exist without colonisation and genocide that happened in this country, and I think that's something that I think is really prevalent, has been really prevalent in a lot of the work that we've been doing lately, and that notion is really prevalent. It sort of takes it away from it being another black problem or a black issue, but it sort of makes me look at it systemically as well, and look at the environmental, I guess, pressures or environmental factors that allow lateral violence to really flourish or allow lateral violence to occur and continue to occur, whether that be in the workplace or outside in community as well. I think it's probably something that it's not necessarily unique to Aboriginal communities, but it's something that we have to navigate on a constant basis as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not unique to our community, but it is. It is really common with marginalised communities that have had similar historical challenges as we've had. Like you pointed out, that colonisation, it's a symptom of that. What do you think? It's an interesting point because it's something that's probably recognised among a lot of mob, but maybe not understood broader. I guess with non-Indigenous people that we interact with or work with or come into contact with, do you feel like there's an understanding of the origins of lateral violence?
Not necessarily. I think there's like an understanding of a base level understanding of lateral violence. Most people could give you an example of what lateral violence is, but they don't show a deep understanding of the root causes, and they don't show an understanding that it's a systemic issue, that it's created by white systems or non-Aboriginal systems, and that it's exacerbated by non-Aboriginal practices as well. That non-Aboriginal people do contribute to the problem as well, and do create instances of lateral violence, indirectly or directly.
When you're talking about lack of understanding, I guess, of the origin or like the systemic factors that have led or continue to lead to lateral violence. I think that's something that is a really interesting point, because when people think about the environments that they exist in, and we're talking about something like lateral violence, everyone's minds go maybe like fairly so like directly to finding solutions, but like what you're finding a solution for the surface level symptom of the problem without understanding the origins or where it comes from. What roadblocks do you see in people addressing it in their own spaces?
I think it would only be addressed on an individual basis. In that sense, it would be reactive rather than a proactive response. So you would address individuals' behaviour, but it wouldn't address the systems that create it. It's like taking Panadol for tonsillitis, for instance. It's addressing the symptoms without actually addressing the root cause, which would be to take an antibiotic to deal with the bacterial infection. It's sort of looking at it from that level would only be addressing the symptoms. So we would only be addressing things, like you said, at the surface level. To address the root cause, you still need to look at things systemically. Look at the systemic the systemic causes for lateral violence. Look at the environments that allow it to take root. Really, look at the environments that allow it to, I guess, that allow it to occur with unabated or unabetted, and that's something that I think is ineffective. Like, it would be an ineffective response to lateral violence. It wouldn't really address the fact that it continues to occur, and that it wouldn't be an adequate response, I think.
I think as well, man, like we've both worked in spaces, that, white sectors, dominated white sectors, and you see a lot of lateral violence in those sectors for various reasons. And something else that I see is that I empathise with like non-Indigenous people in those spaces being hesitant to engage because of, especially because I guess most of the solutions that are brought forward are reactive, like how you're saying, to like an individual situation. And it's probably, I do empathise a little bit, because without understanding the origins and the systemic aspects of lateral violence in their own spaces, it's intimidating, because although like it can fit descriptions like harassment, like you said, it's different.
Yeah.
There's more nuances, and if they're not understood, I think it's really hard for non-Indigenous systems to address it on a systemic level.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a significant issue. I think there's a lot of fear to address it as well. And it's probably because, like you said, it probably is because there's a lack of understanding of what it is systemically, or how it occurs systemically as well. I think it's probably, if I could walk back something I said before, I think it's really important to address it at both a systemic and an individual level. It's probably important to do it. It's almost two sides of the same coin. Addressing it systemically augments what happens at an individual level in managing it. I think sometimes non-Aboriginal people might see it as just a black issue that they don't have the right to be involved in, or they're worried about becoming involved in. But in saying that, it allows it to continue. And I think as well, there's probably a lack of understanding, and because they're non-Aboriginal, they don't think that they can contribute to it.
Yeah.
Where that's not the case. It actually is exacerbated by sometimes people not acting in a culturally safe manner, and doing things like advice shopping or elevating the voices or experience of one Aboriginal staff member over the others, when there's, we know collectively that there's a lot of different experiences and a lot of diversity amongst our communities as well. So what may be the case for one person or one community might not be the case for others. And often there's this sort of blanket, sort of homogenous viewpoint of Aboriginal communities as well. And just little things like that, those nuances where it does exacerbate lateral violence to a degree, particularly in a workplace setting. Forcing Aboriginal staff to compete over jobs is another one. Like I said, advice shopping is probably a really, really big trigger point. Recruitment's a huge trigger point actually as well. And you know what? I'm just gonna go fucking introspective and personal as well. What's the most fucked up example of fucked up experience of lateral violence that you've had?
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, so many, to be honest with you. You know what's funny? There's probably people who'd also say that I've displayed those attributes before. I might contest it, but it's also important to recognise that these things are often complex and nuanced, and perspective's really important. I think working in government for a long time, and this wouldn't be unique to me. I think most people who've worked in these sorts of places have experienced lateral violence, or they would feel like that they have. Sometimes it's unclear. Sometimes it's really just personal stuff. But then because of the system that you're in, that personal stuff is lateral violence. And then when you're a black fella, the worst lateral violence you can experience is the one that follows you home.
Yeah.
Because it's all good when it's at work. You turn your laptop off, you turn your phone off, and you get, it's not all good, but you get respite.
Yeah.
When you're connected to a person in a community, and these things then following out to local footy on Sunday, that becomes pretty stressful.
And I think that is something that's not talked about enough in terms of stresses that are placed on black fellas in a workplace setting, because it has and does bleed into your everyday personal life, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And lateral violence itself, when it does do that, it's really fucked up, and it's incredibly stressful. But like you said, there's no respite from it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, it doesn't, the ability for someone to tear down your personal reputation and tear down your entire identity, and potentially fracture relationships you have with different communities or family members or your home, is something that I think is constantly weighing on blackfellas, and it is really difficult to deal with as well. And there's no real right or wrong answer, but I think it's worth just acknowledging that's almost a continual stress, whether that be in a workplace setting or outside the workplace and community. It's this constant burden or pressure that we have on ourselves.
But for sure, I was having a yarn to sister girl that I know, not really at work that we're doing, but just having a yarn to her and her director, who was white, that they're going to do this and that. And I was like, I think you're doing great stuff, but God, be prepared, because when you make this decision and not that one, no matter which decision you make, you're going to cop some flack in the community. It was a community that I knew,
Yeah.
And the white director goes, we only need support from the people we need support from to do this well and stuff. We had no idea that this woman who's working for her, who's really the brains behind this, she's going to get lifted by mob no matter what she does, no matter what choice she makes.
Yeah.
Especially when there's funding involved and there's all these things, it just becomes more heated because it's people's livelihoods, which I understand. But the director, we were having a different conversation.
Yeah.
There was a total lack of understanding of what that meant, because she's going to close her laptop and go home.
And
she doesn't go to a funeral and see these people run her down in community or go on a birthday or go into the footy. She'll never experience that. And not only did she never experience it, she didn't even understand that as a concept,
It shows a complete lack of understanding of how systems contribute to lateral violence as well. Because for me, that's an example of systemic lateral violence, or systems having an impact on lateral violence or creating lateral violence. Because funding's a big one, right? for someone to receive funding, someone also has to miss out, generally speaking. You're pitting Aboriginal community organisations against each other, or bodies against each other, in a competitive manner. They're probably working on a shoestring budget as it is. So that's just creating an environment where it's creating a powder keg, really. It's creating this really explosive environment where it's pitting Aboriginal people against each other. And like that woman, like you were saying about that woman, no matter what she does, she's going to get lifted, she's going to cop it as well. So it's almost using her as a shield in a sense, unfairly as a shield. And like you said, there's that lack of understanding that non-Aboriginal decision making does impact on the Aboriginal communities, and it does create these instances or these systems that lateral violence not only occurs but it actually thrives.
For sure, and like that's a good example of a systemic one, because funding and the way that we fund or do not fund people is like a really wide systemic way. And it's also a good example because there's like things that people can do to mitigate, like the experience of lateral violence from the Aboriginal people who are involved in those decisions. Like there's really simple things like having the people making the decision come from community, external to the funder. Like that's a really simple thing that not many people do because they don't want to relinquish control of the decision, but actually protects everyone, and you're going to get a better outcome. And it's probably one of those ones that to us seems simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But when it's been done in such a way for such a long time, like a system finds a way to defend its own power. So mob can advocate it even from within the system, but it's pretty rare. But we have seen it. You know, we've seen people have better experiences going through those processes. For sure, it's something that the Aboriginal Languages Trust implemented as well in their grants processes. It brings in the expertise from community, so they have a better understanding around community need. They have a better understanding around navigating community, and they have a better understanding around the skills and capacity and strengths at a community level as well. They're making the decisions in the best interest of their mob. So it's protecting everyone in that sense, but it also gets a better outcome in that sense as well. I think, you know, the thing is, because I've seen it done successfully, that's where I think is the most frustrating thing for me. Because if it was a process that was stepping outside the box or stepping outside the norm and hadn't been implemented, I can understand why there's some reservations. But because I'm seeing it increasingly in different sectors, I think that's where my frustration stems from, because it's shown to be effective, it's shown to work, it's shown to be in place within government or within that sort of decision making process around grants and funding, and it's just a better way of doing business. So I think that's why I get frustrated, because I think there's a good model in place already and that people aren't utilising it, probably because they want to defend that their power essentially around decision making. They want to still control the outcomes and the determinations. And for someone who's like, I'm a bit of a control freak myself, so I'm probably someone that can empathize with that to a degree, but I also don't think it's an effective way to fund communities. And as well, so I think where I see, particularly in funding rounds, where I see a lot of frustration, and where I, having worked in funding programs before, what I get really frustrated with is, I think a lack of communication, like clear communication around decision making. Yeah.
And I was always taught that any decision you make, you need to justify. It might not, there's usually pros and cons to any sort of decision that you make, but as long as you can justify and explain the rationale, as long as it can stand up to scrutiny, then I think there's a level of integrity that's attached to that decision. But if you can't do that, or refuse to do that and refuse to communicate that, then it's just going to create tension. And there's a lack of understanding of that, and there's probably a bit of a slowness in responding to concerns in that way.
Yeah, but like the clear communication bit, I think that's like transparency. I've thought about this before. Like transparency always serves mob, whether they're inside something or outside of it.
Yeah.
You know, when we talk about lateral violence, lack of transparency in funding decisions,
Yeah.
it's horrible. It's a one-way ticket to lateral violence, you know, for mob both in and out of the funder. Recruitment.
Yeah.
You know, like so much lateral violence stems from recruitment, how decisions are made, if they lack transparency.
Who makes those decisions?
Who makes them? How were they made? Sometimes there's conversations that happen that shouldn't have happened in recruitment processes. All these types of things, they lead to, you know, conflict that follows mob home, unfortunately. Yeah. And often these, like, lack of transparency is like a systemic thing, or it's a leadership thing. It's often like separate from mob. I think lack of transparency, like it always leads to conflict, always leads to lateral violence. But unfortunately, like, it's probably a reflection as like more of like a society, you know, like withholding information and controlling a narrative is like a really Australian thing to do. You know what I mean? Like, and I think this is just like a symptom of that.
It's a way to covet power, right?
Yeah.
It's a way to sort of, it's a way to increase power or to maintain power in a situation. And I think people sometimes do it not to avoid responsibility. I think they do it to avoid responsibility, but I also think they do it because it allows them a greater level of influence over a process, or allows them a greater level of influence over something. And I think that's a good point around transparency, because with recruitment, it, you know, lateral violence flares up around recruitment all the time, and it's because there's no transparency around the decision-making process and the assessment process and the evaluation process, or usually there isn't. And even the design, like the design of the role as well, like the purpose and the intent and the design of it, what's being assessed, does the role description actually reflect the role itself and the intended purpose of the role and the benefits of the role too. So I think that's a really good point, and I think that's like you said, it's just like a societal thing too, which is hard to change because it is very much I think it is very much a way to shift responsibility, and it's almost a lazy response to a really complex and nuanced issue.
Yeah, and like lateral violence is a symptom of like colonisation, these systems and all these types of things, and it's not the only one.
Yeah.
So, but like you said, like when it gets separated from the root causes of it, then it alleviates responsibility and it becomes a black thing, a black problem that no one really wants to touch.
Yeah.
So then black staff are left in, you know, having pretty terrible experiences. And the more that I reckon about close the gap, you know, culture, culture is like the biggest buzzword ever now. No one cared about it when I was a kid, you know what I mean? And like, even when I started like my professional career, you did cultural work, like no one cared. You know what I mean? And you know what? It was more enjoyable because like you just got left to your own. Like people all across the state would scrap around for funds to do it because no one cared as well. That was the bad bit. You sort of got left alone. It was less complex. Now that it's all buzzy and like people want to attach themselves to certain things and they want to elevate blackfellas or de-elevate blackfellas to suit an agenda or a narrative or for their own personal ambition, it creates this environment for lateral violence, you know, where maybe historically, I don't know, but from my experiences, like no one got elevated that much. So like we were all together.
Yeah.
And then I've seen it happen, you know, and sometimes it's just like organically people get elevated or they don't, rightly or wrongly, and that leads to, you know, conflict. But the conflict isn't about the workplace really, it's more about the conflict that happens because of the elevation in the professional world doesn't always, well, it rarely resembles stature in the community, which is another issue that's like complex, and also like doesn't mean that person's wrong or right, but like people who their voices are elevated, sometimes for good reason, if they don't hold that stature in the community, they become at risk of people who do.
Yeah.
Complex, I'm not saying like everyone on this side's wrong and everyone on that side's right. But again, it's like a systems thing.
I think it bastardizes the way that we look at culture sometimes, or we look at Aboriginal communities. So I think that the issue with the elevation of one particular voice over the other is problematic, because it elevates one experience over the diverse experiences across the state or across the country of different Aboriginal communities.
Yeah.
And because we do have a lot of commonalities, but then there's a lot of nuances and a lot of differences in the way that we do things and the way that we express culture, and even where we are in our cultural journeys, in a sense, and where we are in terms of our cultural revitalization and practices and a whole range of other sort of factors that I probably don't even need to delve into too much. I think that's where it becomes problematic, because it's almost disregarding this really rich, diverse culture and elevating the experiences of an individual, but also a viewpoint that might just be one single viewpoint.
Yeah.
It's almost this notion that it's a homogenous viewpoint, and that's very white in the sense, because it's almost positioning certain blackfellas as leaders, whereas that's really at odds with how we traditionally operate as well. And I think that's where a lot of the tension arises. And because of that too, sometimes it means that communities miss out.
Yeah.
The communities that don't have that viewpoint, or that the nuances of their communities are not understood, so they miss out unfairly, or sometimes they might miss out with whatever it may be in terms of service delivery or funding or policy decision making, and they might not get that seat at the table. It really stems from pitting us against each other in weird ways as well. Kind of like we're fighting over scraps at the table.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it as well. And I think like the tiny bit more focus, even if it's like not always super authentic, on like our people and our outcomes and like culture and these things. It's just like it's elevated
A little bit, yeah.
just a little bit, and it's made a difference, I think. And you know, we yarned a mob from all over the state, sometimes over the country, and there's a lot of consistencies in like what people say.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like we use the word complex a lot, like we've spoken about this before, but sometimes I think it is complex, but I feel like that's just a way to alleviate responsibility from anyone.
Yeah.
When like, yeah, like there's complexities, but also like there's been decisions and things that are ongoing, like decisions that are made on an ongoing basis that continue to lead to the same result, and they continue to be made in the same way. Like at some point there needs to be like a systemic inwards look and say, okay, how is this environment being created? Why is it getting worse?
The best example of someone that didn't look at the complexities is probably like a former manager of mine. And, you know, there was an instance where I felt I was on the receiving end of like lateral violence from a coworker or a colleague. And I think regardless of whether it was lateral violence or not, it was certainly bullying. Like some of the comments about my family were pretty horrible, and about me were pretty horrible. And my manager at the time was like, is it lateral violence? Is it or not? It doesn't really matter. It's still bullying. It's still against the code of conduct. So addressed it immediately with that staff member. I didn't even have to say anything, like, because the remarks are made to her as well, or in her viewpoint. So it almost took the onus off me, and it was addressed, and it didn't happen again in that, at least in that setting.
Yeah.
From that staff member, it was just addressed immediately, and there was no bullshitting around like, you know, oh, what's my role as a non-Aboriginal person in this space? Is it a systemic issue? Is it complex? Yes and no. It was kind of like, well, it was a clear example of poor behaviour, so I'm going to address that poor behaviour. And I think that's where we sort of tend to overthink as well.
Yeah.
To a degree. Absolutely, it's systemic, and I think, like we talked about, it's got to be addressed at a systemic level to be effective, because otherwise you're just addressing the symptoms. You're not being proactive and actually addressing the environment or changing the environment that allows it to take place in the first place. But also you've still got to address the individual instances of it, and you still have to have a level of, I wouldn't even say courage or bravery, you just have to have a level of understanding of your own personal responsibility to call it out and to address it.
Yeah, like I think like integrity is another word.
Yeah.
I think integrity and transparency, like they're housemates, them too, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you don't work with integrity, like you hide from transparency. You know what I mean? You actively reject it.
You can't have integrity without being transparent as well, in most cases.
Definitely. And if you're not working in a certain way where you're taking responsibility, where you're holding the responsibility as a leader or someone who holds power in that space, you're not going to want to be transparent in how decisions are made and how things are dealt with, and just sort of leads to it then becoming a personal conflict.
Yeah.
Which is not fair. And a lot of like these spaces that we talk about, it's actually a safe space for people to behave in a way that they wouldn't in the community.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because they're actually protected by a white system that's scared to engage with them on this. And then it's really ironic. Do you know what I mean? Like mob are more at risk of lateral violence in a white setting than in like a community where like you're actually around your own people more. Like when you're a minority, it gets worse.
And I think that's because, it's because you don't have the same community support systems around you, right? Like if you're part of community, you have your family there, people you've worked with, or people that you've been involved with at a community level for all your life. Like they would either defend you, or that there would be some sort of evidence, almost like upfront evidence, without you saying anything, to refute what people are saying or what people are claiming. And in the workplace, there's not as much of that. And because you are by yourself, you're isolated, you're more at risk of experiencing lateral violence.
Yeah, and I think like it's sort of side topic, but it's sort of relevant as well to like social media and media broadly, and the role that it plays in like inciting, like making people feel comfortable to speak in a certain way or to interact with each other in a certain way. It creates like environments that aren't really real. Yeah. Like whether it's in a workplace, in a white setting, or like whether it's online, or when you're actually interacting in your day-to-day life, it's a pretty rare experience. Do you know what I mean? Like people don't interact like that out in the real world. I got pulled up by an auntie back home like last month. Something I thought was okay, maybe didn't have as much information, which I wouldn't have been privy to without her. She disagreed with a decision that I had made. Super respectful. Windy of her too, I got a lot of respect for her. She pulled me aside in person back home. We discussed it, and then we sat down and had had a feed. And I thought, like, this is such a real life interaction, because people, who, maybe have been, who someone would think are being laterally violent towards them. They, there's words like accountability get thrown up, which is important. Accountability is important. Like when Aunt pulled me up the other day, I was like grateful towards her. Like I still am, like heaps, even though it was windy. And then, but that's what accountability looks like. Accountability is not like displaying behaviors that are like disrespectful in a public setting, in a safe setting where you feel safe because of some social construct that doesn't actually exist in our communities outside of like the white world. And I think it becomes like a breeding ground for people to act a certain way. And because these people, like you're saying, like maybe they don't feel like they hold responsibility in dealing with it, it gets allowed to fester and multiply.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really good example too of like something that's, because I wouldn't say lateral violence is just conflict between black fellas as well.
No.
It's and conflict can be handled in a really mature and respectful way. Like black fellas are experts traditionally, when it comes to conflict management and conflict resolution, we wouldn't have been able to survive as long as we did if there was continual conflict and no way to manage that. And that's where I think it's often misconstrued. You can disagree with someone, disagree with your own family at a level, but still have those respectful conversations and still address it and still hold people accountable, but in a way that's not tearing people down as well, and in a way that's not hyper aggressive or unconscionable as well.
And you know, it's a really interesting word that like we use a lot as a people, staunch.
Yeah.
Really interesting word, because I love using it too. Like I think of people back home or people in my family, I just think they're staunch, like they're so strong. Yeah, I mean, like they're stoic, like they're just strong in their values. Like no one could rock them.
Yeah.
And I look up to those people, but we use staunch a lot of the time to describe someone who's aggressive towards their own mob, like to each other. And that seems a perverse use of like a word that's positive.
It's been bastardized. It's been degraded as a term because we've misused it and we've misaligned it with people who are, like you said, just overly aggressive, that communicate aggressively, that essentially are just combative, and that's their default setting. And traditionally it was used for people who were, like you said, uncompromising of their values, who were actually going through those rights movements to really fight for some basic rights for our mob, and basic level, like not basic, but you know, just general recognition of our mob, and had to put up with some horrible backlash and racism and systemic shit, really, just to be treated like an ordinary citizen at a minimum. And now we use it for someone who's just negative and combative against everyone and everything. And I think there's, like, for me as a black fella, I think there needs to be we need to reframe how we use that word, or reframe what we think is strength as well, because I don't necessarily think it's valuable to continually be angry. That's not to say that there's a lack of passion or desire for things to change, but I think we can be more strategic, and I think there's an ability for us to be more collegiate and collaborative with each other.
Yeah, I think like anger towards each other is wasted energy.
Yeah.
If we're going to be angry, let's punch up.
Yeah, that's it.
Not down and sideways at each other. And understand why it happens, because every marginalised community globally goes through the same thing. You know, like, so it's not unique to us, that. But you're right, like you think about like our old people, like how far you want to go back, you know, make like sometimes we're unable to push through these things because of like living in the aftermath of ongoing colonization, you know. Like we're still navigating through that as a community, and I reckon in a decade or two or older we'll think of it, we'll see it differently again. You know what I mean, which is a good thing. So I feel that there's this need to be angry at times, and like, but it's got to be like in the right direction. You see that like from mob who are leaders, and people often say things like, oh, you know, well, they're not going to get white people's support, but maybe that's not what they're after. But when we're sort of punching down at each other, it becomes really difficult. And because we don't get afforded the same rights within certain sectors, like to bring it back to work, like that when we have like disagreements that are done in a way that's probably inappropriate or disrespectful in a workplace, it's not right, but all our voices become null and void in that conversation. You know, I remember talking to the women from Waminda last year. They made a really good point that stuck with me, that like we live in a democratic society, but blackfellas aren't allowed to be democratic. So like I think when you're in the sector and you're a minority, or you're doing a piece of work with mob, being able to like come to conclusions, even if they're not the same, in a way that's respectful, it helps us progress things along.
It's an unfair measurement that's placed on our mob, right? We have to have a unified voice or view in order to achieve progress in some shape or form. And if we don't have that, it's used as an excuse not to progress anything, or not to make any progress, and not to further our rights or further our needs, and that's, or aspirations. Sorry, and I think that's probably a good example of an unfair sort of system that's placed upon us. But if we continue to lash out at each other around that and not lash out at the unfair measurement, unfair sort of standard that we have to meet every single time compared to the rest of Australia, compared to the rest of the world, then I think that's, like you said, wasted energy.
Yeah.
It's sort of just going to lead to us burning out, and it's going to make things difficult for our own mob, really.
Yeah, and like a disclaimer too, like these are our thoughts, opinions based on the experiences that we have working in different sectors in our lives.
Yeah.
I understand that there's like varying views, but I guess this is from our perspective as people who are sort of working across a lot of different sectors, which is it's really interesting to see how different people navigate it. You know, you've been doing some work with different leaders about how to address this in different sectors. We've spoken a lot about the nuances and the systemic, systemic factors that lead to lateral violence. What would be like your advice for people who are undertaking work to minimise the lateral violence in their spaces?
The organisation, if you're working in an organisation, if it's within a like workplace or a sector that you're working in, there's got to be a maturity from the organisation to look at their practices, or lack thereof, and look at their gaps and actually have some commitment to make some change as well. I don't think, I've heard opinions and seen things where it's acknowledged as an issue, and the solutions are too hard, or no other workplace has implemented it, so why should they? And it's a reductive notion. It's a lazy approach, and it's a weak approach. And I think if I was a leader in an organisation trying to respond to lateral violence, so I'd have to look at it from the point of view of being honest, having some level of integrity and self-reflection in the flaws of the organisation, and then actually have some commitment to implementing a range of different solutions that hopefully suit the needs of your black staff as well, and hopefully make things better for your black staff and better for Aboriginal communities interacting with your organisation as well. So that's probably my biggest takeaway. I think there's an acknowledgement that there's an issue, but sometimes there's not an acknowledgement of what's required, or there's no commitment to actually implementing solutions to that issue.
Yeah, I think like the commitment that goes back to like taking responsibility, which we spoke about earlier. Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think like going back to some stuff that we spoke about at one point as well is like, in order to really commit to improving the sector, I think that there has to be a commitment to understanding the nuances that have led to this environment, which is looking inwards. It goes back to that integrity and transparency and working in a way that's really honest, which is not really a symptom of Australian institutions or sectors or society as a whole when it comes to our people. So you used the word courage before, and maybe that's like too much of a compliment. Like you said, it's just doing the right thing. Yeah. But I think that there's got to be a commitment to that too.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good way to put it. Probably a better way to put it than what I did as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, we've spoken a lot about lateral violence. We've also been doing some work that's interconnected in a way that maybe you wouldn't imagine until you step into that world, which is anti-racism. And we're seeing, and like cultural practice in these different spaces that we've both been a part of, both at Impact, but also in our career before at Impact. And I think like when we start finding solutions for like anti-racism, rightfully so, we include a lot of Aboriginal voices. Something that begins out as a positive ends in conflict, because of the elevation of some voices against others. We talk cultural practice is a really good example. Like I know, like from other work I've done, you have mob who say, and this isn't against mob or their differences, because we talked about the nuances of community culture, where people are from, you know. You hear mob say, well, I don't think that anyone should practice culture of country.
Yeah.
That's, you know, if that's what they think, that's more than fair. Like that's what they practice and that's what they've been taught. Obviously, you get other mob that say, well, I practice country no matter culture. It's no matter what country I'm on. So then immediately you've got these two really opposing views while they're trying to bring cultural practice into like a white sector.
Yeah.
And I can understand, like, again, I hate the word complex, but I can understand there's a complexity there. But if we talk about like cultural safety as like a thing, sometimes I don't really love the term, because I feel like cultural safety is like a human right. And again, like the women from Waminda, which, you know, is a great service, learned so much from them. They said, well, when you're working in like a space that's a white sector that relates to Aboriginal people, usually got a traumatic relationship with mob. Like you can never be culturally safe as an Aboriginal person within that sector to start with, which I think is a really good point. Then on the flip of that, cultural safety should be like a human right. Like it's not something that like some high bar that we should try and attain. Like it should be a human right, even though it's not. I think being like culturally responsive is probably like better language to use, because you're being responsive to the person, their community, their cultural practices,
and their cultural needs, and the way that they sort of want to experience culture as well, or the way that they view culture too, which is, you know, interchangeable between person to person too.
For sure. We live in Sydney.
Yeah.
Like there could be like there's mob from every corner in Sydney for the last 100 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I reckon there's more mob from Cowra in Sydney than in Cowra. You know, between Glebe and Redfern alone. You know, you got mob from up the coast, down the coast, other side of the country. It's a really good example because it's a melting pot of people who have different experiences, but share like values and things, like the important stuff. But how that is implemented can look differently, I guess. And I think like being responsive to that is important, but it's also not the usual way for like systems to work.
Yeah.
Because you want to have a policy that's overarching, you know, because it fits well. It's easy to implement.
Yeah.
It's also easy like to overlook.
Yeah.
To like put it out there and then let black fellas work within it.
Yeah.
Being responsive takes like leadership that is informed with how black fellas need to work and relies on relationships with black fellas that you're working with and for, which is often like not a priority, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point around that sort of like cookie cutter approach to policy that we often implement too, and that policy for black fellas has to be culturally responsive. And I think too, like cultural safety, I use it a lot. Like it's just as part of my
we
wording.
all do, right? Yeah.
And I think as well, it's just a soft way to say anti-racist. Really, like a lot of the time, and I think we soften our wording around that too.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I like that anti-racist rhetoric and
it's proactive.
Proactive. It's stronger. It's less nebulous, I think. But cultural responsiveness is something far more descriptive in another way as well, and it probably works with those nuances and those differences and those sort of different needs and understandings of culture as well. Like a good example of, I guess, the difference that I saw is like with the Gumbaynggirr language stuff that my cousin's doing. Like in his teaching method, he's very much like you need to. It's very much based on speaking. So the whole thing is like trying to immerse yourself, and the different levels that you go through, or different stages that you go through. Sorry, it's encouraging you to speak at every point. And his viewpoint, I think he said something to me around like, I wouldn't expect you to say every single word perfectly because you're just being exposed to the language. It's like you're, say, like a toddler, but you wouldn't discourage a toddler from speaking. Like you would encourage them to still speak and then pronounce words properly, and then through that practice you'll pronounce words properly and you'll get better, and then you'll develop out sentences and all of that other stuff. And then there was these guys that I saw from the South Coast who had the most amazing language program and alphabet and teaching style, and their viewpoints were completely different. Like they were taught, if you can't say the word properly, don't speak it. So you need to basically hone your language to the point that you can use it properly in a sentence. You speak it perfectly, fluently. Oh, not fluently, but pronounce perfectly. And it was very different approaches. Like I would say, incongruent approaches. And they still both had amazing results from their language work. Yeah. And, I think it just shows the sort of differences in how blackfellas can approach cultural learning as well.
Yeah, and looking for the same outcome.
But very different methods, and that's okay as well. It comes down to personal preference too. Like,
I think like when people are trying to interpret like these nuances in their systems or their workspaces, or they're trying to address conflict that comes from it, that's been created because there was conflict of practice or something like that. I think like there's usually white people who are responsible for navigating it, like just because HR or leaders are predominantly white in systems, but they isolate themselves. So like there's this cultural nuanced conflict. Sometimes it's not as nuanced. Sometimes like it's quite clear like there's something that's inappropriate and disrespectful. But when it's like the more nuanced stuff, this is an unplanned plug, but like we've done cultural mentoring with white executives and leaders. I think like that's when that stuff becomes really important, because most white fellas never had a important or meaningful relationship with an Aboriginal person until they're in these work environments, and now they're trying to navigate something that's like totally foreign to them, and they probably have fear of, because not having a relationship with blackfellas usually relates in like often results in like some level of fear or anxiety around interacting with blackfellas. I think like that's when those things become really important, where they have relationships of people in the community who understand not just like the nuances per se, but just like giving them confidence to navigate it in a way that's mature, and responsive, like we said, because a lot of the time that fear is like leading to these nuances becoming instances of lateral violence.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point as well. Like having to navigate something you have no understanding of would be pretty difficult. But also like, I think for me, like even as I was giving that example, I was like, yeah, of course there's going to be different like methods or approaches or sort of concepts for like language revitalization across the state. So it's not saying one's right or one's wrong. Like as a black fellow, sort of understand that it's just like we all have we all want the same. We don't all want the same outcomes, but I guess in that setting it was like, the cultural practice is gonna look really different across different mobs and across even amongst the one community. But that's completely fine. Whereas being a white person and trying to navigate or also potentially endorse a particular approach over another,
it just shouldn't be done. It's not worth attempting. It's better off to find solutions that are again like nuanced and responsive to like, and it's also like maximizing the value. Like if you have Aboriginal voices internally and more importantly probably externally providing solution advice, and they conflict with one another, it's not really about discarding one to elevate another.
It's being culturally responsive to ensure that both have an opportunity to be implemented.
To improve the service for Aboriginal people, to improve the experiences or outcomes for Aboriginal people. They're not always even though they seem like they're in direct conflict, like the example you gave, with the language, they're actually not in direct conflict.
No.
Like they can definitely coexist at the same time. It 100%. And I think, you know, when you were talking about like maybe anxiety or fear of people, you know, white leaders or HR people, policy people, whatever it is, navigating this, there's also that there's the anxiety, and then which makes them want to wash their hands with a lot. But there's also ego too,
Yeah.
because if you can't like seek advice or guidance, seeking advice or guidance often makes people feel like they're inadequate and question their role in the process. But it's totally necessary. Like otherwise, we're just going around the same cycle again of Aboriginal people fighting for scraps at the table,
Yeah.
and not having actual decision-making power.
Yeah. No, I think that's...
Advice, what would be your throwaway line, or not your throwaway line, but your takeaway line for people who are, for non-Indigenous leaders, you know, who are attempting to navigate lateral violence in their sectors? Key takeaway.
You've got to show a level of courage and intent to actually deal with it as well, to take some action against it and to implement some solutions as well. You can't just wash your hands of it. You can't just see it as a black issue, which it's not just a black issue, because the root cause is it directly stems from colonization. So my key takeaway would be that you need to show a level of maturity to listen to black staff, but also Aboriginal communities, and to look at implementing solutions to make a safer workplace.
Yeah, I think I'll wrap this up by just stating that the things we talked about are our views and opinions from our experiences. I know we spoke about it earlier, and that there may be more who disagree with certain views, and that's okay too. And it's a conversation that like could go for a long time. We've tried to fit a lot into an hour, but if there are mob or there are non-Indigenous people who are navigating lateral violence in their spaces or in their communities, feel free to reach out. Feel free to get in contact with Impact. It's something that we've been working around for about a year now, I reckon, about.
Yeah.
Doing some really specific lateral violence work.
Yeah.
About 12 months. So like I think we've got to head around a bit of it, and we're always happy to help out. Thanks for tuning in.